Hello, welcome to episode of the Bubbs on Sports podcast. Today is Monday, June 26th. Hope everyone's having a good day so far and had a good rest of their day yesterday. It is, in fact, Monday, June 26th here today. We've got a lot to get into coming off of a packed sports weekend. A lot went down in New York baseball. If you're a Mets fan, you're getting up today again very disappointed. You're frustrated. You're angry. Any of those negative things to describe the feeling of Mets fans right now would probably fit what Mets fans are thinking and how they're feeling after losing 2 of 3 in Philly. And it's not the fact that they lost 2 of 3 in Philly. It's how they lost 2 and 3 in Philly and how they lost yesterday's game. So we'll obviously get into that today as well. We'll get to the Yankees. A good homestand for them. Still, definitely, they're not playing their best baseball, but a 4-2 homestand, still something to be happy about. I said going in 3-3. Go 3-3. Find a way, win 2 of 3 against Seattle. And then, you know what? Texas is tough. Take one game from that. Maybe salvage the series on the final game of the 3-game set with Garrett Cole on the mound or something like that. That's what I said. That's not what I ultimately wanted, but I said the least you could do is, hey, go 3-3. Take one of 2. Take one of the 2 games against George Kirby and Luis Castillo, and then win the final game against Seattle, which they didn't do. They took the first 2 games, then they lost the final game, and then lost the first game at Texas, then won the next 2. But still, with the roster the way it is right now without Aaron Judge, going 4-2 against a Mariners team that's underachieved this year, no doubt, but they faced 2 of their better pitchers in Castillo and obviously George Kirby and got the job done, and in Texas, who's been one of the best teams in baseball. So to take go 4-2 against those 2 teams and win yesterday with Garrett Cole not having his best stuff was definitely a solid day at the ballpark for the New York Yankees, and now they hit the road for 6 games, 3 in Oakland and 3 in St. Louis before heading back next week for a big 4-game set with another homestand beginning against the Orioles next week. So we'll get into the Yankees. We'll get into the Mets today. We'll get you ready for the Mets game tonight. That's basically what's on tap. It's going to be all things Yankees and Mets. Talk about both teams, what they did well, what they didn't do. I mean, the Mets, what a gross disaster they were. Yankees day off today, as I mentioned. They'll be back tomorrow against the A's. And look, I mean, again, it's the A's is the Cardinals. 6 games against 2 teams that aren't very good. The A's are horrible, and the Cardinals are up there with the Mets and the Padres as teams that have underachieved this season after having big off seasons and going into the year with high expectations. So we'll start today with the Mets. Then we'll get to the Yankees. We usually start with the Yankees, but we got to start with the Mets because, again, they lose another series. They haven't won a series at all yet in June. Well, I mean, technically they had, which was they swept the Phillies on June 1st. But technically their last series win, because they won the second game of that 3-game set against Philly, was back on May 31st. It is June 26th. Since then, this is what the Mets have done. Got swept by Toronto, swept by the Braves, lost 2 of 3 against the Pirates, split against the Yankees, lost 2 of 3 against the Cardinals, lost 2 of 3 against the Astros, and then now this weekend, they lost 2 of 3 against Philly. They won game 2, they lost game 1, and in the way they lost yesterday is what has Mets fans so frustrated. And now they'll open up a 7-game homestand, which will start with 4 against Milwaukee and then 3 against San Francisco. And they're getting a very different San Francisco team than they got to start the season in San Francisco. When they took care of business against them, they had that good West Coast road trip. That was the last time you probably was able to feel good about the Mets. And then they obviously had a couple of those stretches against the Rays and the Guardians and then the Phillies sweeping them and getting in within 3.5 games. But before we really get into what took place yesterday, and not even just that, just the fact that the Mets are a bad baseball team, and there needs to be change at some point. At some point, they can't just let this slide game in, game out, night in, night out, because the season is sinking. It is absolutely sinking right now. It is a complete disaster. We thought last week was rock bottom for them when they lost, obviously, against the Cardinals and then lost against the the Astros, went 2-4 over those 6 games. You thought that was rock bottom. And then you go into the Philly series, and now this is even worse than that. And now this is rock bottom. I mean, can it get any worse for the Mets? I mean, every time we say this is rock bottom, like 2-3 games later, they find a way to lose another way. They find a way to lose again. They find a way to lose in another embarrassing fashion. And we saw that again this weekend. And as we currently sit here on June 26th, the Mets are 35-42. They are 15 games out of the NL East. I mean, the NL East is done. They are a fourth-place team right now in the National League East. And there's really no coming back because the Phillies are 5 games ahead of them. And obviously the Marlins are 9 games up on them. And the Nationals, who are a rebuilding team, a team that isn't expected to do much, improved this year than what they were last year. They're definitely more competitive this season, but still, they're 30-47. They did take 2 of 3 against San Diego, but they're only 5 games back of the Mets. The Mets better watch out. They keep losing. The Nationals are going to creep up on them. The Mets, in some other divisions, you look at it, they could be, even closer to last. I mean, you look at the NL Central, they would only be about 3 games out of last place. Now, they would be a whole lot closer to first place in the NL Central. But the NL, it is a disaster right now for the New York Mets. And now you're 8 games back in the wild card, and that's what means the most because the division's been out of hand for a while now. And now you got to go for the wild card. There's no shot you're making up a 15-game lead. And let's be honest here, even going into the season, I think a lot of people thought the Mets could compete for the division. But the division was still going to be hard, especially with the way they kind of got off to that slow start. Like the wild card was the most realistic possibility for the New York Mets to get to the postseason once they started to hit some of those struggles. But now the wild card's not even realistic. And the bottom line is this. We got to take out the payroll. We've got to forget about, the payroll, forget about the names on the roster because, look, at the end of the day, they're a New York team. They're getting a lot of media coverage like Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer. On paper, you say to yourself, let's try and find a way and turn this season around. The bottom line is the Mets are just a bad team. They're not any good. There's no coming back from this. The season is over. They're 8 games back in the wild card. They are 15 games back in the National League East. They're losing games in pathetic fashion. They're walking guys, hitting guys, errors all over the field. They can't run the bases. They lose games in so many different ways. They find new ways to lose. Bad teams find new ways to lose. The bottom line is this. No matter what the Mets do, they can fire somebody, which I agree that I think there needs to be change. We'll get to that here in a second. But no matter what the Mets do, the season is over. The season's done. They're just not good. They don't have enough pieces. Their pieces that they thought would be solid aren't any good. They're still not getting enough production from the veterans. I mean, there's so many questionable bullpen decisions. The front office and some of the things that, it starts at the top, it goes all the way down the buck and the players. Everybody deserves blame. But at the end of the day, they're just not good. They're done. I still think there's people out there that think, let's call up this prospect. Let's call up this guy. Let's make this trade. I mean, if you're the Mets, the trade deadline is getting closer. I don't even think you buy. You can't even buy. I mean, there's a chance you go into the trade deadline and you're still 8, 9, 10 games back of a wild card spot. Teams that are that far out of a wild card spot and that far out of their division race don't buy at the deadline. It's going to be really interesting to see now what the Mets do, but the season's over. It's done. And I know it's June. I understand it's June 26th, and you still have a lot of season left to be played. But, I mean, this is a team that is horrible. They are one of the worst teams in the National League. They have the 4th worst record in the National League. Like, this isn't like a team that's just going through some minor struggles right now. They are so far out of it. Good teams find ways to win. Bad teams find ways to lose. We talk about a lot of times how good teams can beat you in many different ways. Sometimes they can beat you with their pitching, their hitting, their fielding, whatever it is, their bullpen, whatever it is. They're managing, decision making, all that stuff. The Mets, they find new ways to lose every game. They can't beat you with their pitching. They can't beat you with your hitting. The one night their hitting's on, the next, then their pitching's off. The one night their hitting's off and their pitching's on. And they lost another series. They just continue to lose. They continue to just lose series. I mean, this has been going on for the entire season now. At some point, you just got to come to the realization this team stinks. And I know a lot of people have, but I still think there's a select few people out there, and even within the Mets as well. Hold on, look, you're not going to lose optimism. You're not going to say, the front office, Buck Showalter's not going to say the season's over, but they're still acting like this team is right in the heart of a playoff race. Like, they're 8 games out. I mean, they're horrible. They are terrible. And yesterday was probably the worst loss of the season. And you feel like you've said that about 10 times already this year. You felt like you said it coming out of the Houston series. You felt like you said it coming out of the Atlanta series. That's how bad the New York Mets loss yesterday was, and that's how many times we've sat here this season on the show and on many other shows across baseball and in New York and Mets podcasts and all that stuff. Everybody has said this is the worst loss about 5 times, 10 times this year. There's been so many losses that go up there on this is rock bottom. No, this has got to be rock bottom. This has got to be rock bottom. And then yesterday, we found a new rock bottom. So they lose 7-6. And the way they lost that game yesterday is just pathetic. And I'll be short and sweet because I'm sure many of you know the way it went down. But you're winning that entire game, right? You're up 6-3 going into the bottom of the 8th. And, there's questions about what the Mets were doing in terms of the arms that they brought in and the guys that they decided to pitch. Jeff Brigham obviously gets a lot of the blame because he hit the batters. He drove, the winning run, or not the walk-off, but the winning run in. It was just a display of really what the Mets bullpen has been this year. The Mets bullpen this year has been brutal. And outside of David Robertson and Adam Ottavino, and Ottavino too, I mean, he's been shaky. He hasn't been bad, but he's not very, he's had a couple rough outings here and here. David Robertson's been very, very solid. He's been very solid this season for the Mets. And, look, they were without Edwin Diaz, and I think Robertson's done a good enough job taking over. But, I mean, you look at the arms they rolled out there yesterday. You get a good start from Carlos Carrasco. They put up some runs. They put up 6 runs. I mean, you should win a game. Carrasco gives you 2 runs across 5 innings. Was a solid outing for him. Good outing. He's had some really rough ones. Not bad at all, right? Very inconsistent. Gives you a good outing. You put up 6 runs. There's no excuse you lose. You have no business losing that game. So then you go into the bottom of the 8th, and you get 3 batters walk. You walk 3 batters. You hit 2 batters. And Brett Beatty makes the 1 error. And I'll tell you this. Brett Beatty went into his post-game press conference, and a lot of Met fans and even Yankee fans as well, we've been complaining about the lack of accountability with both teams' managers, both Aaron Boone and Buck Showalter, both teams' front offices, acting like the losing's okay, acting like everything's fine. And we've said that a lot this year on the podcast. Baseball this season in New York hasn't been the best ever, right? But Beatty did go into his post-game press conference and put the blame on him. Now, look, was it a catchable ball it wasn't an easy play for Jeff McNeil to make. I mean, it wasn't a great throw. There's been so many other mistakes in the field. Still, it is an error. The run scores, but at the end of the day, you can't walk guys and you can't hit batters as well. So it was accumulation of the whole thing. But you do have to respect Brett Beatty for standing up there outside his locker after the game and taking accountability. Saying, hey, look, that's game's on me. It's not easy, when you're going through a losing streak or when you're going through, just a season that's been brutal, it's not always easy for guys to stand up there and take the blame after another brutal loss. It's easy to just say, oh, it's a tough play, just gotta, hope, get back to work and, right, it's tough for guys to stand up there and take the blame and say, hey, this game's on me. This game's on me. Like, it's tough. And Lindor does that. Stan does that. Like, it's not an easy thing to do. Guys don't always do it. But you do have to respect Brett Beatty there. But, I mean, come on now. I mean, you got 3 hit batters. There are 2 hit batters. You walk 3. You make an error. It was basically a non-contact inning for the Phillies. Very little contact. I think they had a single, or I think maybe had like 2 hits. That was it. It wasn't like they were just hitting gaps. I think that's a worse way to lose than if they just caught up there and were just hitting. Like if they just hit and drove in 4 runs because they just were rallying and they had a couple extra base hits, a homer, a couple singles, just like 6 hits and just 4 runs and they're hitting. Like that's one thing. Sometimes you just got to give credit to the other team. But losing the way they did, where the Phillies basically stood up there, watched pitches go by. 3-2 pitch from Jeff Brigham wasn't even close. Watching pitches just go by and then getting hit by them and scoring 4 runs, I mean, that's brutal. It's brutal. And they find a new ways to lose. And now you start to question, what was Buck Showalter doing? And it's funny because, again, who was available, who wasn't available for the New York Mets was a big question. So Buck Showalter said that Ottavino wasn't available for the game yesterday. However, in his postgame, however, Ottavino after said he was available. David Robertson had 1 inning to give today, but Showalter decided to save him for the 9th inning, which just made no sense. So Buck Showalter decided to save him for the 9th. And you saw David Robertson warming up in the bullpen. He was warming up. He decided to save him for the 9th, which didn't make much sense because, you could clearly see the bullpen was struggling. You could clearly see the Phillies were about to do something big. They were hitting guys. They were making errors. They were walking guys. That's a situation where you bring in David Robertson. You don't just have him warming up there for nothing. You got to bring him in that situation. And in why, Ottavino saying that he was available, Buck Showalter saying he wasn't available, I'm not going to sit here and read into that too much, but that is a little concerning if you're a fan, because that shows you that there's obviously a disconnect there. And again, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but that does show you if Ottavino says I was available and Buck Showalter said he wasn't available, that's a disconnect between the coach and the player. And that's the last thing you want to see. So something's got to change. Look, again, I think the season's over. I've officially ruled the season over for the Mets. I think it's done. I think personally, you get to the deadline, try and sell off as many pieces as you can. Especially some of these, contracts that are rough. I'm not saying go ahead and trade Lindor, but try and sell off some of these other pieces. They already did it with Eduardo Escobar. Try and get as many prospects as you can back. And then figure it out from there. I think you call up, the young guys. Like, call up Mauricio, call up Vientos again, and just roll the second half of the season with the young players. Just roll with them, see what they can do, develop, and reset. And eventually, Showalter's not surviving this. There's a couple of things the Mets can do in terms of making change. Again, they could just straight up sell at the deadline and just mail it in and say, hey, we're so far out of the wild card spot. There's so many holes to this roster. We're not going to be able to solve them with a trade or two. It's going to take a whole revamping of this roster. It's not just going to be able to be solved at the trade deadline. It's not. So that could happen. Maybe, look, I don't know what's going to happen with Shohei. Do you just mail it in and say, you know what, next season we go all in for Shohei? We go and strike some other trades, maybe for guys that are not as old. Right, I don't know what that's just brainstorming down the road. I mean, does Shohei even want to come here after seeing what disaster they've turned into? I don't know. That's off-season conversations that the Mets will have because Shohei's not going at the deadline. Some people thought he might, so the Angels could get something for him, but the Angels are in the are in a playoff race right now, or right in the heart of the playoff wild card race in the American League. So there's no sense in them trading Shohei right now. If they were 10 games back in the division and have no shot and were horrible like they've usually been, maybe you say that, but they could either do that and then just say, hey, have Buck ride out the rest of the season and then eventually fire him. Look, again, it goes top to bottom. I always say that in organizations. There's blame to go around. I mean, you look at the Mets and you go into this season, they still didn't have a DH. You went into the offseason. Their biggest need was DH. Their biggest need was a big power bat in the lineup. And they went into the season and it was still Daniel Vogelbach. And that obviously wasn't good enough last year. So that does fall on Billy Epler. That falls on Steve Cohen. Just like the Yankees go into every season now without a left fielder. That doesn't so much fall on Boone. That falls on Hal Steinbrenner and Brian Cashman for just avoiding it, for just letting it slide. Same thing in this situation. Now, yesterday's decision-making was horrible by Buck Showalter. I don't know why you don't bring in David Robertson in that situation. If Ottavino was available, I don't know why he wasn't in. He said he wasn't available. I don't know if that's Buck just saying that to try and cover up, just trying to cover up his mistake. I don't know what that was. Buck just not taking accountability, because that's what it kind of sounds like. It kind of sounds like Ottavino saying, hey, I was available, and Buck's kind of just saying he wasn't available just to try and avoid, taking account, whatever it was. Maybe I'm reading into it too much, but or you could make change right now. If the Mets say, hey, look at the Phillies last season. I mean, we'll get to the Yankees here in a second, but look at what the Phillies did last year. They fired Joe Girardi. The team was going nowhere. They had talent. They had pieces. The team was just going nowhere. He was driving it right into the ground. And he said, you know what? We need to change. We need to change the locker room voice. This roster is too good to be playing this bad. And sure enough, they did that. Rob Thompson, they did that. They just squeaked into the wild card. It was up until about the final day or two of the regular season. They squeak into the wild card. We all know they go to the World Series, win the National League pennant. They don't win the World Series, but they win the pennant. They get to the World Series. They end up losing to Houston, but still, they got all that way. They were sinking. They changed the voice and brought in Rob Thompson, and they started to win. Do you do that? Is it do you need to change the voice in the locker room? And look, I said this when Buck Showalter took over. The way it ended in Baltimore was ugly. The way it ended was ugly in Baltimore. Now, I know they wanted to enter into a rebuild, and it was kind of out of his control, and they ended up, selling off pieces like Machado and guys like that, and Adam Jones went on his way, and Jonathan Scope, and, some of the guys that were on those Orioles teams when they were pretty good. Matt Wieters, I think, as well. Like, those guys, they started, that was when they kind of entered their rebuild and where they are now with the new young guys, and now they're playing very well. But towards the end there, it got ugly. Like, Showalter's never really, and again, I'm not trying to just now all of a sudden say, hey, look, Showalter was never a good manager. I'm not saying that, but you look at his career, he's never been able to put a team over the top. I mean, the Yankee teams, he's gotten close. They get rid of him, and then the dynasty happens with Joe Torre. Like, you look at the Orioles, and again, they entered through that rebuild towards the end. The Orioles might be a tough example because towards the end it got ugly, but that's because they tore it apart and they were rebuilding. But even then, he got to the postseason with them, but he was able to finish. Is it just, old school? Again, there's a risk with old school managers. Like Dusty Baker, it works. It worked in Houston with Dusty Baker. They won a World Series. Maybe a little bit different scenario situation with Houston, but it worked. Tony La Russa in Chicago, it failed. It completely failed. And the White Sox still haven't recovered. They're embarrassing. And now Buck, it doesn't seem like it's working. So look, there's examples that old school managers work, and then there's examples that old school managers don't work. Bruce Bochy in Texas, it's working. He's taken over, held those guys accountable, making the right decisions. They've got the talent, they've got the pieces. They just needed the guy in place. And look at the Rangers, one of the better teams in baseball. So, there's examples of old school guys working and old school guys not working. Maybe Buck Showalter, there's definitely that possibility that Buck Showalter is just an old school guy that his way of doing things just doesn't resonate with the current player. Just doesn't. And that happens. Bruce Bochy's does. Dusty Baker obviously does. Tony La Russa never did. So, different examples, obviously different situations, but again, there's blame to go all around, but you feel like if you want any shot to save this season, you roll out, either you bring up the young guys and just, bench some of the veterans and say, hey, until you start playing better, until we're going to roll out these guys, which Buck has an obsession with the veterans. He doesn't sit the young players, which you don't really quite understand why. Or do you just fire Buck Showalter? Maybe it lights a little bit of a fire under the team. But here's another thing too, though, and we'll get to the Yankees. But again, firing a coach can only do so much. Is firing Buck Showalter going to make Lindor bat 270? Like, is he just going to all of a sudden bat 300 over the month of July and turn into this excellent player that he was in Cleveland? Or is, a little bit, the stuff like that. Now, if Buck Showalter wasn't manager yesterday, do they win that game? There's a chance. So those are the different things that you weigh, because there's a chance that the other guy, or if Buck wasn't there, there's a chance they bring in David Roberts in that situation, bring in Adam Ottavino instead of Jeff Brigham in the other AAA arms that they were rolling out there. So that's where things currently stand with the New York Mets as they lose yet another game. And now you go across town, or lose another series. Now you go across down here to the New York Yankees, who are right now just trying to tread water. They're finding a way. They're getting the job done. It's not all been pretty. There's definitely been some ugly moments. I think, as Yankee fans, there's still a lot of frustration, but there is some still frustration with the way things are going with the season. Kind of the way Hal Steinbrenner, Aaron Boone, Brian Cashman, the things that they have said, the lack of accountability at times. It's been definitely kind of a bumpy road up to this point, but still a very good homestand for the New York Yankees. You go 4-2 on the homestand. Again, I went into the homestand. I went into these 6 games against the Mariners, obviously starting on Tuesday of last week, and then Texas, which started on Friday night into yesterday. And I said, find a way to just go 3-3, play 500 baseball. At worst, you think, you lose both series, you go 2-4. Or you get swept by Texas, which was a real possibility. And then you're like, man, 2-4, 1-5, that's brutal. But coming off of the ugly series in Boston, where you get swept in Boston, you get absolutely embarrassed in Boston, both on Friday night when they lose 15-5, and then they lose again in the doubleheader on Sunday. The bats don't come alive, terrible pitching, all that stuff. You go into the homestand, you're like, hey, play 500 baseball. And the Yankees come out of it, and they go 4-2. And that's a very good homestand. You take 2 of 3 against Seattle, and you won both games against George Kirby and Luis Castillo, 2 of their better pitchers. They somehow lost against Wu, which didn't make much sense to me, but it was just a bad night at the ballpark. And then Friday night comes around, and you lose that game as well. And that's been the streakiness of the Yankees season. And it's been both the Yankees and the Mets, really. They're both streaky. The Mets now are more bad than they are good. A lot more bad. They're basically bad now. They're just bad. They're not any good. Month of May, though, for the Mets, there was a lot of stretches there where they would win, they would win 2 series, go 4-2, go have a 5-1 stretch, sweep a team, and then they would lose like 6 straight. And they would win 3 in a row, then lose 3 in a row. Now the Mets, they just lose every series. So they're not even streaky anymore. They're just consistently bad. But when you look at the Yankees, they've been streaky. They'll have those 2 nights against the Mariners where they get the job done. Pitching's good. They do just enough against Castillo and George Kirby, and they lose 10-2. And they lose 4-2 in 10 innings. And some questionable decision-making from Aaron Boone, where, bringing in Donaldson in the 10th to pinch hit for Billy McKinney, who's been very good. Didn't make any sense. It wasn't even a lefty. To bring in the lefty right, it didn't make any sense in that situation. Donaldson ends up striking out. So then you win on Saturday, you get the shutout. Sevy was very good. That's promising because Sevy going into that outing had a 9.16 ERA in June and overall had an ERA of 6.30. After starting with 2 really good outings against Cincinnati and San Diego, he really started to struggle those next 4 outings. That felt like a must good outing for Sevy. I don't know the word. It wasn't a must win for outing. It was like he needed that outing. And you go into that outing and you're like, geez, Texas, Sevy's struggling, their offense. Middle game of the 2-game set. You got to find a way to get the Cole tomorrow, and they did. Herman's obviously, struggled the last 2 outings. Sevy was a good. You hope that's the start of something for Sevy. You hope that's the start of a turnaround for him as to what he was more of the first 2 outings of his season. And then you get the job done yesterday. And look, Billy McKinney's been very good. You're still getting production from Jake Bauers. Harrison Bader with the big hit yesterday. What I loved most about yesterday is Cole didn't have his best stuff. Cole went out there and gave you 4 2/3, 3 runs. Struck out 7. He did have that. But he allowed 9 hits. The pitch count was up there. He threw 107 pitches without even getting to the 5th. Didn't have his best stuff at all. It wasn't a very pretty day for Garrett Cole. He worked through it. He kept them in the game. When he left the mound, it was 3-2. He kept them in the game, and that's what Cole's going to do. And then you go to the bottom of the 8th, and Bader got involved. Stanton got involved. Those are the guys that you need to get going. Bader's been very good, but Stanton, you hope I always say this to Stanton, every hit Stanton gets, you just got to hope that that's the start of something. Every time he rockets a ball 110 miles an hour plus, whether it goes out of the stadium or whether it stays in, you just got to hope it's the start. And the Yankees have an opportunity here over these next 6 games, 3 against Oakland and 3 against St. Louis on the road. Day off today, obviously, as they'll travel to Oakland, although I believe they left last night. I think they posted on their Twitter page, so they're already in Oakland. But you have those 6 games coming up. That's an opportunity here. At least you got to go 4-2 on this road trip. At least. Because the way I look at it is, the least you can do is win these 2 series. I think the bonus is you got to sweep Oakland. I mean, they're 20-60. They're 40 games under 500. I don't care if you're with or without Aaron Judge. I mean, there's some AAA teams that might be able to beat Oakland. I mean, Oakland's basically a AAA team. And I know they're playing better than what they were. I mean, there was one point where they haven't had a bad month. Like, they got on that 7 or that 8, I think it was 7 or 8 game winning streak the A's were on. They had that reverse fan boycott, but they're still 1-9 in the last 10. They went back to their losing ways. So at one point they were playing better, and I think at one point Royals ended up having the worst record in baseball, which the Royals don't get enough attention for how bad they are. The Royals are pathetic. They are 22-56. But back to the A's. You get 3 games against the A's. You get 3 games against a team that can't hit and can't pitch. Game 1, you got Johnny Brino versus Paul Blackburn. Blackburn's the A's best pitcher. Him and J.P. Sears. Game 2, you get Sears. But even then, those 2 games, Paul Blackburn and J.P. Sears are their 2 better pitchers. Still 2 guys that have ERAs north of 4. Like, that's all you need to know about the A's. And in the final game, you get James Caprillion, who has been awful this season. Got guys with a ton of walks, has an ERA north of 6. Terrible. So, 3 games against Oakland. You've got to sweep them, in my opinion. I think the bare minimum is 4-2. I think anything less than that is bad because that means you lose one of the series. Realistically, I think you can go 5-1. I think St. Louis will take a game, but you should be able to go into St. Louis, a team 7 games below 500. Again, they're up there with the Mets and the Padres and teams like that as the biggest disappointments in baseball. You got to go into that series and at least take 2 of 3. Take 2 of 3. That's what I think. Take 2 of 3 in that series. You'll have Cole going in one of those games. I believe it's probably going to be that Saturday game because Sevy will go Friday. Saturday will be Cole. Sunday will probably be that Sunday game will probably be, I don't even know at this point. No, because Burrito's going tomorrow. So they'll probably go a 5th starter. Burrito, Vasquez, somebody like that. Because Burrito's going tomorrow. So, I don't know who quite will go that Sunday game. I'm looking now. Jordan Montgomery will go that Sunday. So the Yankees will get their former teammate on Sunday. But sweep the A's and take 2 of 3 against St. Louis. Have a 5-1 road trip. That's realistic. With or without Aaron Judge, you're going up against the worst team in baseball in the A's, and you're going up against one of the biggest disappointments in baseball in the St. Louis Cardinals. So you come out of that road trip 5-3, you look at it and you say, you're 48, or you come out of that road trip at 5-1. You are 48-36. You're now 12 games up on 500. I'd be interested to see where they would currently stand after that in the wild card race. But we saw what they did earlier in the year in Oakland. When they were struggling, they were going through a little bit of a rough stretch. They crushed them. And now you look at another opportunity against Oakland. Like, this is the opportunity. Like, this is the chance. Yeah, these teams are bad, and yeah, you can only take so much from these series in terms of what the results are. Like, if they sweep Oakland, we can't all of a sudden say, oh yeah, the Yankees are going to win the World Series. It's the Oakland A's. You're supposed to sweep them. You're supposed to beat them. But these are series that you got to win to build some more cushion, to build some confidence, to boost the stats a little bit. Like, this is a good series for Stanton to get going. Going up against Paul Blackburn, J.P. Sears, and James Caprillion. Should be able to hit those guys. So, take care of business against the A's. Take care of business against the Cardinals. Come back home next week against Baltimore, and that would be a big series. Big series if you enter into that one. At least 12 games up on 500. Alrighty, so now we move on here. Finish things off tonight. As I mentioned, Mets, Brewers tonight against the Brewers. Mets, obviously, 7 games under 500, 35-42. Brewers, 40-37. Colin Ray will be on the mound for the Brewers. He is 3-4 with a 4.88 ERA, and the Mets got Justin Verlander on the mound. He's 2-4 with a 4.50 ERA. 7:10 Eastern tonight. Mets hope that they can get Vintage Verlander. Is Vintage Verlander out tonight for the New York Mets? It'll be interesting. It's going to be interesting. These next couple weeks heading into the deadline is definitely an interesting time for the Mets in terms of like what they want to do with the front office wise. If they want to buy, sell, stay put. I'd imagine they're probably going to stay put. I don't think they're going to completely sell. Like I don't think they're going to. I know they traded Eduardo Escobar, but that's not a huge move. Like Beatty's the third baseman. He never really he was a disappointment here. He had the up and down last year. I believe it was the month of September where he absolutely dominated, helped actually propel the Mets into the postseason. But he's gone again. The guy that was a disappointing signing for them. Personally, in my opinion, I mean maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if the Eduardo Escobar signing necessarily sends a message to the fan base that, hey, we're selling at the deadline. It's Eduardo Escobar. It's almost like trading Daniel Vogelbach. He's just wasn't getting a ton of playing time, goes elsewhere. The Angels need a third baseman because Gio Urshela is down. Or he got hurt with the hip. And he was playing pretty well. So I think they've still got Rendon over there. I don't even know what happened to that guy. I think he's still over there. They've still got some third baseman there, but they need a little bit of help after Gio Urshela went down. So it makes sense for kind of both sides there. Mets are going to roll with Beatty. Angels needed a guy. They get Eduardo Escobar. So I think that's kind of just perfect timing. I don't really know if that's a message that, hey, we're going to sell at the deadline because we traded Eduardo Escobar. If they traded like a Mark Hanna or traded, I don't know, a Starling Marte, I'm just using example. I don't think they're going to trade Marte, but if they traded like a veteran guy like that, maybe that would send a message like, yeah, this is selling. But Eduardo Escobar, I don't know. Maybe it does. We'll see. But Mets got to put up some runs because those fans are going to be ruthless tonight. I mean, ruthless for the rest of the season. Like, if the Mets just keep losing, those fans are going to be ruthless. So, anyway, that'll do it for the podcast here today. For those of you that are interested, I'll have a Bubbs Talking Bronx Bombers podcast up later today. Yes, change the name. That podcast will now be exclusively Yankees content, so I'll take a deeper dive into the Rangers-Yankees series. We'll have series recaps after each one, so I'll get you that later today. And, I'll see you all back here tomorrow. As always, hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching.